with you. Let me see if I can get my first slide to work. There we go. So I wanted to cover essentially just two sections here. And I'm kind of backing away a little bit from the nitty-gritty and the technical details to give people a sense of how we've been applying spatial analysis to prioritize restoration, but also the role that it can play in facilitating collaborations. A lot of restoration is being done, at least out here in the West, through these collaborative groups. And so we've been able to plug in our spatial analysis pretty effectively to target and get some restoration work prioritized on the ground. So I'm just going to walk you through a little bit of how we, what we mean when we're talking restoration and how we frame the issue and how we've gone through and identified priorities for a sample landscape. I'll give you a view of a landscape we developed this tool on in the Lolo National Forest. But then towards the end, I just wanted to open it up a little bit to identify the role that this type of analysis can play in a collaborative setting. And so we've got good examples from Montana, Idaho, Colorado as well. So first off, I mean, the obvious question people ask and what the agencies are wrestling with is, what do we mean when we're talking about restoration? We can restore a million different things out there, and it's pretty unrealistic for us to be able to try to identify a single priority that's going to address all the restoration issues out there on a landscape. So, and the challenge, I've talked to regional wildlife biologists here in the Forest Service who are in charge, for example, of identifying the restoration priority for wildlife. Pretty tall order and pretty unrealistic when you consider that different species are going to need different things, and there's different elements of what might need restoring, even for a given species. So I just threw up a sample here of the different types of things that we could try to address in restoration, but whether it's different habitat types or watershed integrity, forest structure, fire regimes, how do we restore landscape connectivity or salmon runs. And so really, I mostly just put this up to make people aware that we're not going to be able to address these all at once. But there is a method for us to be a little bit more specific in terms of targeting resources for restoration. The second question beyond what we're restoring is how we're going to restore it. There are different mechanisms and different funding sources and different tools that we have to apply to address any given restoration objective. And so, for example, if we're trying to target funding, as we most recently are through this collaborative forest landscape restoration program, there are some sideboards and some eligibility requirements that we need to meet. And so by considering the combination of what we're trying to restore and then the tool that we're going to prioritize in order to address that restoration objective, we can start to narrow down a little bit more specifically where these acres are that we can apply a certain tool to meet a very specific restoration objective. And I just threw these tools out here, such as prescribed fire. Perhaps we want to plant trees after prescribed fire. Not always a great idea, but these are the types of things that are proposed. If we're removing culverts or decommissioning roads, there are lots of different restoration tools that we can apply that might meet several objectives, but we want to have these things clearly in mind, what we're restoring and the tool that we're going to be using to effect that restoration. So how do we set priorities? Because, and this is just a quick slide before I jump into the demonstration of our tool, but there are some common challenges. By looking at all those circles that I just showed you, all the different restoration tools and all the different restoration issues, it's often tempting to just say, well, let's just go get all the data and somehow it will tell us what we need to do. And I would just caution anyone who takes that approach to avoid trying to just dump all of our data into a big pot and stir it around and assume that something is going to come out that's meaningful. We could mix apples and oranges and the price of tea in China, but it might not necessarily address the specific restoration goal that we're after. And so it's also tempting to try to let a model do all that thinking for us. But the disadvantage of that is that we really don't understand what it's doing and how it's weighing different elements. And so as you'll see, our goal through applying this tool is to render a pretty simple and a pretty transparent way to identify priorities. And I just threw up here, for example, a lot of what we do with this type of spatial analysis is to really translate federal land management policy into acres on the ground. So, for example, we've got this Healthy Forest Restoration Act from a few years ago, and we've done some analyses to inform where that legislation should be applied. And as I mentioned, most recently, we're taking advantage of this. We're working on a proposal to take advantage of funding from the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. But in identifying priorities, we're really not trying to, we're not trying to pinpoint exactly the single highest priority for treatment. What we're really trying to do is actually just eliminate places that clearly don't make sense. So if, for example, we're interested in reducing fuels to restore some natural fire regimes where we've been suppressing fire, we could eliminate, for example, things like water and rock. Obviously, rock doesn't burn, and if we're going to address fish or aquatics, we're going to be looking in water. So it's really a very simple logic where we're not trying to identify the single most important priority, but we're really just trying to weed out places that clearly aren't appropriate. And you'll see what that looks like here in a second. And also another challenge that we face whenever we roll out this type of analysis is people say, well, those data don't really reflect what's on the ground. I've been out there and kicked the dirt, and these data, under this pixel are not accurate. Well, that's true, and you could find any flaw in the data, but if we're going to collect landscape data at all, we don't just want to collect them so they sit on a shelf. They should inform decision making, and if the data are more right than wrong, let's at least take advantage of what they say or what they look like so that we can make some decisions based on that level of information. And the other final point is that by weeding out and eliminating places that are not appropriate, it leaves us with a set of candidate stands or candidate sites for restoration. It's not a single stand or a single acre that we're trying to identify. We're just trying to set up a set of a workable decision space so that the land managers who are out there on the ground or the collaborative groups who know the landscape better than we do sitting in our offices to bring their more pragmatic considerations to bear on the resulting set of priorities. So we're really not trying to pinpoint exactly the single highest priority. We're really just trying to set up a decision space where these criteria, these types of criteria are met, and we can then bring to bear a more practical lens when we look at project design and things like that. So this is just a view, a couple more considerations that we want these tools to be consistent so that we can apply this type of approach to any landscape. And so that's really one of the valuable parts of this work, is that we've done this work here in Montana and Idaho, but we're not relying on any uniquely locally available data sets. We're trying to take advantage, we're trying to design this analysis so that you could apply the same logic anywhere. And so that's why we want to make sure that we rely on nationally available data sets, usually agency data sets, so that we can apply them anywhere. And again, these should be pretty intuitive and simple and easy to explain to people as we roll this out. So this is just an example. I'm going to dive into a little bit of what this tool actually looks like. And this is where the thinking ahead of time really pays off. And again, to avoid that whole data soup syndrome, it's important to bring to bear only the data that are relevant to address a given restoration objective. And so in this case, we're trying to identify specifically where we can apply a fuel reduction, whether it's mechanical thinning or prescribed burning. We're trying to identify where we can apply that tool so that we can restore a natural fire regime that may have been overgrown due to a few decades of fire suppression. And so the logic that we apply here is explained through these filters that you see on the screen. What we start with is dry mixed conifer forest types. And forgive diving into the ecology here a little bit, but it's important to recognize that a few decades of fire suppression will not have impacted high elevation forests that only burn every 200 to 300 years, for example. It's only the forests that historically burned frequently that are likely to have overgrown or to have those few decades of fire suppression will have resulted in an overgrowth of abundant fuel in the forest types that historically burned very frequently. So it's these forest types that we start with, and then we can apply some filters. So again, we're eliminating places like lodgepole pine, high elevation, subalpine fir, because those are not areas that are likely to have been impacted by a few decades of fire suppression. So we start with these dry mixed conifer forest types, and then our logic goes that if they've burned at all recently in the past 20 to 30 years, then they are not as likely to need any fuel reduction as those stands that have burned. The next level of filtering here is that we really want to restore and prioritize those forests that have large trees and that are at risk because now we've had this buildup of fuel unnaturally because we've been suppressing fires. And so we really want to go after and prioritize the large stands that may be at risk of burning unnaturally hot because they have this overloaded fuel condition. So we just select out the large and medium size classes, and we eliminate anything that's just small seedling, sapling conditions. So those first three layers are really just looking at ecological considerations, but then we can also apply some more pragmatic filters. So in this case, we've eliminated places like wilderness areas, private land, inventoried roadless areas, not because there isn't work to be done there, but because it's going to be a hell of a lot harder to go into a wilderness area to propose doing a restoration project than it would be to work in the roaded, more managed part of the landscape. Certainly if you're prioritizing lands for the Forest Service, they don't have much business dictating what's going to happen on private land. So we've tried to apply these pragmatic filters, and then we also have filtered the landscape according to accessibility. So we don't want to have to create new roads to go do any restoration treatments, so we've eliminated any stands that are greater than 300 meters from a road. So, and then the last step, we just overlay other habitat and more anecdotal data sets so that we can be aware if we need to go into an area, we can be aware of the issues and the concerns or any red flags that we should be aware of, so that if, for example, we've identified a restoration priority in lynx habitat, we can know whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, or at least that we need to be cognizant of the fact that there's some overlap there. So that's just a slide. Let me show you what this looks like now on the landscape. So this is the landscape most recently that we've been focusing this tool on, and this is the result. What we've got here is a proposal. It's not a final proposal, but this is the latest run of our tool, where across these three districts on the Flathead, the Lolo, and the Helena National Forests, these three districts, we've been able to identify 36,000 acres that would meet our criteria for appropriate consideration for restoration and fuel reduction treatments. And the color code here is that we've ranked them according to distance from a community so that you can achieve a better, you can address two objectives, both community protection and ecological restoration, if you focus those restoration treatments closer to communities. So how did we get here? This is what the filtering looks like. Tom DeLuca and I originally developed this on a single watershed in the Lolo National Forest. This is the Montour Creek watershed, It's almost 100,000 acres, and we start out by just looking, as you can see in maroon here, that brown color. Those are the frequent fire forest types based on the land cover data that's available for the landscape. So if you just focus on those forest types, that's quite a bit of work to do. 33,000 acres still within this watershed. But if we eliminate anything that's burned recently, that's what you see in orange. And so we can presume that those are less of a priority for treatment or fuel reduction than areas that haven't burned. So when you drop them out, that reduces the landscape of the candidate landscapes. If we eliminate stands that don't include a large or medium size class, then, because again, we're going after maintaining those large trees within a undergrowth of overloaded fuels, if we eliminate all the early serow or the young seedling sapling stands, then we eliminate these orange areas. So they drop out. If we also want to eliminate, if we want to prioritize further and really only go after the large stands, we can play this forward as a scenario. We can say, well, let's include the medium-sized class, or let's only focus on the large size class. But we can play that forward as a scenario, and we drop out places that you see in orange again. And we're starting to whittle down our landscape. Here we've got 9,300 acres down from 33,000 acres. If we eliminate then places that are roadless or on private land, that restricts, again, a more pragmatic lens. That restricts our view to the managed portion of this watershed that is Forest Service land. If you take a final step and then eliminate any stands that are greater than 300 meters from a road, that's what you see in orange here. And we drop those out, and you can see that we've basically gone from a landscape that was originally 33,000 acres of suitable forest types. By applying these lenses, we've dropped it down to 3,300 acres, which is a much more manageable priority or set of priorities for a Forest Service then, or a collaborative, to then apply some more pragmatic filters based on what they know these stands to be like. And just to indicate that we want to take advantage of this as a scenario building exercise. So just because we've run through that set of filters doesn't mean it's the only answer. We think it's pretty good, but the group or the stakeholders at play here who are deciding how to restore this landscape are going to perhaps want to be able to see different options. What happens if we include a large size class, and what happens if we include both a large and a medium size class? So that's what you see the differences here between the maroon and the yellow. The yellow represents only the large size classes, and the maroon represents the medium size classes. So you can see what that does to a workable set of priorities. And again, this creates a decision space that's much more workable than just looking at the whole landscape, for example, 33,000 acres, and wondering where to start. As a final step then, after we have this set of priorities, we can overlay just some other anecdotal data sets. They don't necessarily drive the prioritization, but it's important for us to know if we're going to go into wolverine denning habitat, for example, when we address one of our restoration priorities. And it's also equally valuable to know when they simply don't overlap, and we certainly appreciate wolverine denning habitat is very important, but it doesn't overlap with any of our priorities for restoration. So we've considered it, but we know it doesn't need to, we're not going to have conflict there. Same thing with grizzly bear denning habitat, just for example. So that's an example of how our filtering works, and I've blown through it a little quickly, but because I want to save time for questions. But what happened? This is only addressing a single element of restoration. So how do we address things like watershed restoration? Are we talking about different aquatic species? Are we talking about the forest structure of a municipal watershed? How do we address terrestrial habitat? There's a long list of potential restoration issues that we could address, but the challenge is really in identifying how do we target specific restoration tools to address specific restoration objectives. And it's only after we work through that set of priorities for each issue individually that we can then start to look at where they overlap as a result at the end of this filtering process for each individual issue. And so I'll give you an example here of some other approaches. This is, again, getting towards more of a holistic approach to restoration, so we're not only addressing a single facet of it, but we can apply this type of tool to a range of issues and then look for the overlap among them. This just gives you a view of the same landscape where we prioritize some stands that may be in need of some treatment to establish greater diversity among stands that have been previously harvested. A lot of these areas have been heavily managed, in some cases clear-cut, and you've got a monocrop, an even-aged cohort of forest that's growing up in an unnatural condition. We could prioritize those areas as being in need of treatment for some sort of thinning, to reapply some sort of natural structure, so that as they grow, they're going to be more on a natural trajectory rather than just growing up as a single even-aged stand. And when you consider the two of these priorities together, you can start to get towards a more comprehensive picture of where priorities lie for both mechanical thinning and prescribed burning, as well as addressing the stands that might need restoration as a result of prior harvest. This gives you a view of just what some of these stands look like, and we can take this down onto the ground. This is just a view of Google Earth where these are some of the priorities we identified for stands that may need some mechanical thinning or prescribed burning. In many cases, it's useful to see where the data are simply incorrect, but we do want to be able to get a sense if we're identifying places that are appropriate. You can see that it's certainly within 300 meters of a road. It looks like they include larger trees here. This is an unharvested patch right here, and it's certainly a bit open. It seems to be the lower elevation and right near the grasslands where you'd expect fire to be a little more frequent. Same thing here when we target stands that are that may need some restoration, some types of restoration treatments to address areas that have been previously harvested. So there's a way that we can validate more than just looking at pixels on a map. We can start to translate those into real landscapes on the ground. This is just a view, similar type of approach where we've tried to combine a previous analysis of where the wildland-urban interface is so that that can also inform where our restoration priorities might be ranked higher. And so by combining that map of the wildland-urban interface, we can rank the restoration priorities according to the distance from those communities, from that wildland-urban interface. And so you can see here we've just ranked the colors so that the places that are brightest yellow are restoration priorities that are closer to communities, and those that are bluer are farther away and perhaps would be less, they would address only a restoration objective and they wouldn't also be able to address a community protection goal. This is specific to the language of the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. One more example I'm going to go through very quickly just to give you a sense that we can build some logic to address aquatic issues. So this is just some work that Tom DeLuca and I ginned up to look at where we might focus for some efforts on road decommissioning to reduce sediment in bull trout spawning habitat. And so the logic simply goes that we are trying to identify the cold enough streams for bull trout to spawn successfully. That's essentially an elevational threshold. And then if those streams are cold enough to support bull trout spawning, then we can overlay areas of high road density. And then if that high road density within bull trout spawning habitat also has unstable slopes, we would presume that there is some opportunity for restoration to mitigate sediment delivery that would hamper spawning for bull trout. And so in this case, we're focusing in the Clearwater Basin and just the northern portion here. But everything you see in blue on this screen shows that elevational threshold where it will be cold enough for bull trout to spawn successfully. The pixels you see now here in brown represent the highest relative road density. And this map here in maroon shows you where the extremely high and high risk classes are for road suitability in terms of slope stability. These are unstable slopes. And so if you have a high road density in spawning habitat for bull trout that also has unstable slopes, then that's what you see here in purple. And you can, again, identify places. This is a decision space that we can then bring more pragmatic concerns to bear, where people say, well, it's going to be really hard, for example, for us to get over to the northeastern portion of this landscape relative to some other areas. But it identifies where these criteria are met and where we should expect some opportunities for restoration. And if you look at the landscape on the ground, indeed, this is quite a eroded landscape, sure to deliver lots of sediment to an occupied spawning bull trout stream. So that really gives you just a sense of how we've been going about our prioritization. And I've just got a couple more slides here that show you, that bring up some ideas about how we've been able to take advantage of GIS and just our landscape analysis, our capacity for landscape analysis, that's really helped facilitate the collaborations themselves. So across Montana, I should give credit to Scott Brennan, who's really been moving a lot of this work and integrating this work into these collaboratives in Montana, Brad Brooks, John McCarthy here in Idaho, and a lot of our work, a lot of this thinking originated over in Colorado with Tom Fry and Greg Applett in the Front Range Fuels Treatment Partnership. And some lessons, and so you can see that we've applied this type of tool across a pretty broad landscape. Both, we developed this originally within the Montour watershed, but then we broadened it out because we rely on readily available data. We can apply this to any landscape, and we can start to get a sense of how priorities emerge across the region beyond just a single watershed or a single district. So at this point, we've completed this type of analysis across the Lincoln District of the Helena, the Sealy District of the Lolo, the entire Lolo National Forest, the entire Clearwater Basin, which also spans 2 national forests. And this gives you a sense then across the region of where priorities should emerge. The benefit of having a consistent approach that relies on readily available data for any landscape is that we can look at priorities on a very small scale, at a very specific area, but we can also get a sense of perhaps where funding and where resources should be allocated so that those restoration goals are met where they are most appropriate. It makes sense that across the Continental Divide there's a lot more drier forest types here in the Lolo than there is in the much wetter Clearwater landscape. So what you see in purple is where that fire and fuels restoration priority has emerged from our filtering process, but we've also applied a community fire planning zone analysis that essentially is that map of the WUI. So we try to get a sense of where you can do some fuel reduction that addresses both community protection and ecological restoration. So in terms of how this analysis plugs into a collaboration, it's been really effective as a calling card to be able to come to a collaborative when, for example, Scott approached the Lincoln District of the Helena Forest. He said, we want to work with you all, but we're not just another stakeholder. We've got a really unique tool that we could contribute, and it's not just the Wilderness Society's mandate or single direction about what we think needs to happen out there. We want this to also be a reflection of what the group wants. And so we've made ourselves available to play forward different scenarios and to come back to the group to look at different iterations of what they'd like to see. So it's not a single result that we then want to make the collaborative go apply, but we really want to try to engage with the group so that it's a reflection of what their goals are. And as I said, it's helpful because it identifies this, it results in a suite of candidates that establishes a nice decision space for them to bring their more pragmatic and more locally informed expertise to bear. It's also really useful for us to be positioned in this type of spot where we can be driving the information that the group considers. And so we essentially are acting as a hub for all the information that these different collaboratives are looking at. And that's strategically useful for us because it's a unique contribution we can make, but we also could better influence the options that they're considering. We can make sure that those lenses that they're considering meet our criteria as well. It's much more helpful to be involved and be part of be the hub of the process than really looking at it from outside. And then the last thing is that it's really useful as a communication tool. If we can explain this through a sequence of logical filters, if people agree that rock won't burn, if people agree that fish live in water, then this is what results as across the landscape as a priority. Simple criteria eventually stack up to render a pretty useful set of priorities. And that's what I've got. I didn't want it to be too long. I'm sorry if it's been laborious, but I appreciate your all's patience, and I mostly wanted to open it up for questions and feedback, and we're eager to see how this type of approach can be applied more broadly across the regions we're working in, beyond just Montana, Idaho, but Colorado, California. Lots of different places have expressed interest, and we mostly want to see how we can try to get this type of approach better utilized. So with that, I will open it up and share it with the group if anyone has any questions, comments, or feedback.